The freezing November wind whipped across the manicured lawn of the estate in Greenwich, biting through my worn canvas jacket. I stood there on the porch, my boots caked with a bit of mud from the garden back home, holding a vintage crystal bowl wrapped in a faded kitchen towel. It was a family heirloom, something my wife, Martha, had promised our daughter on her wedding day. Martha wasn't here to give it to her, so I'd driven 3 hours in my old, rattling Chevy Silverado to deliver it personally. I could see them through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the elite, the powerful, and the beautiful, all bathed in the warm, golden glow of a chandelier that probably cost more than my first house. I reached out and pressed the brass doorbell. The chime echoed deep inside the mansion, a rich, melodic sound that seemed to mock the shivering man standing on the doormat. A moment later, the heavy mahogany door swung open. It wasn't my daughter who greeted me, but her husband, Caleb Vane. Caleb was a man who wore his ambition like a weapon, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with surgical precision. The second he saw me, his welcoming smile didn't just fade, it curdled. He didn't even open the screen door. He just stood behind the glass, looking at me like I was a leak in the ceiling. "What are you doing here, Elias?" he asked, his voice low and sharp, designed not to carry back to the party. I held up the crystal bowl, trying to keep my hands from shaking. "It's Thanksgiving, Caleb. I brought the heirloom Madeline wanted, and I thought maybe there was a seat for me after all." Caleb's laugh was short and devoid of humor. He looked over my shoulder at my truck parked in the driveway, a dented, rust-streaked eyesore sitting between a silver Porsche and a matte black Bentley. "I have nothing to thank you for, old man," he spat, his eyes cold. "We're hosting the executive board tonight. People who actually matter. People who don't show up looking like they just crawled out of a storm drain. Get out." Before I could find my voice, Madeline appeared behind him. She looked stunning in a deep emerald dress, her hair swept up in a way that made her look like she'd been born into this world of wealth, rather than raised in a small cottage with a father who worked 2 jobs to pay for her private schooling. She didn't look at the bowl in my hands. She didn't look at the blue tint of my lips from the cold. She looked at the guests behind her, her face tightening with a mix of shame and irritation. "Dad, I told you on Tuesday," she whispered, though the edge in her voice cut deeper than a shout. "There are only important people here tonight. This is a career-defining evening for us. You don't belong at this table. Please, just go before someone sees you." The door slammed shut. The heavy thud of the bolt sliding into place felt like a physical strike to my chest. I stood there for a long beat, the silence of the porch amplified by the muffled sounds of laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes from within. I turned away, my boots heavy as lead, and began the long walk back to the truck. I didn't know it yet, but that slam of the door was the sound of a bridge burning a bridge. I had spent 30 years building with every drop of sweat and every dollar I'd ever earned. They thought they were protecting their status from a ghost of their past. They had no idea they had just locked out the only man who truly owned the floor they were standing on. The drive back to my small house in Bridgeport felt like a descent into a different reality. My mind kept drifting back to the phone call on Tuesday. The phone had rung while I was in my wood shop, the smell of cedar and sawdust filling the air. Madeline's voice had been honey-sweet then. She needed $3,000. A catering emergency, she'd called it. She said she wanted everything to be perfect for the heavy hitters from Vanguard Holdings. I'd transferred the money within minutes, the same way I'd transferred the $80,000 for her MBA and the 6-figure down payment for that very mansion she'd just kicked me away from. I'd always lived simply, keeping my business life entirely separate from my fatherly life. To her, I was just Elias Sterling, the retired handyman who lived on a pension and wore flannel. She'd forgotten, or perhaps she never truly knew, why I had so much pension to give in the first place. As I pulled into my gravel driveway, the headlights of the Chevy caught the reflection of the small, unassuming brass plaque on my office door inside the house. Sterling, Associates, Private Equity. I sat in the cab of the truck for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. The hurt was a dull ache, but beneath it, a cold, crystalline clarity began to take hold. I had spent my life being the safety net, the silent provider who asked for nothing but a place at the table. I had allowed them to believe I was small so they could feel big. But if I didn't belong at their table, then perhaps they didn't belong in the life I had funded for them. I went inside, the house feeling larger and emptier than usual. Martha's portrait hung in the hallway, her eyes kind and watchful. I felt a pang of guilt. I had promised her I'd take care of our little girl, but as I looked at the dark screen of my phone, seeing the bank notification for the $3,000, Caleb was currently spending on Wagyu beef and vintage wine to impress his superiors. I realized that taking care of someone sometimes means letting them feel the weight of the world without your hands holding it up. I sat down at my mahogany desk, the only expensive thing in the house, and opened my laptop. The blue light reflected in my glasses as I logged into the Vanguard Holdings internal portal. As a primary silent partner and the majority shareholder of the parent firm, I had access to things Madeline and Caleb couldn't even dream of. I pulled up the guest list for their exclusive dinner. My eyes scanned the names. Arthur Kensington, the CEO. Marcus Thorne, the head of M.A. These weren't just important people. These were men I had played poker with for 20 years. These were men who called me when they needed $100 million to bridge a merger. My finger hovered over the keyboard. I could see the live updates of the company's social feed. Madeline had posted a photo of the table setting. The caption read, "Building a legacy with the best in the business. Success is earned, not given." A bitter taste rose in my throat. Success is earned. I looked at the records of the loans I'd given Caleb to cover his gambling debts 3 years ago, debts Madeline still didn't know about. I looked at the gifts that had kept their lifestyle afloat every time Caleb missed a bonus. I decided then that I wouldn't go to bed. I wouldn't sit in the dark and nurse my wounds. Instead, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in months. It rang twice before a gravelly, authoritative voice answered. "Elias? It's nearly 8 o'clock on Thanksgiving. I assumed you were neck-deep in turkey and family," Arthur Kensington said, sounding genuinely surprised. "Plans changed, Arthur," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "I hear you're at a dinner party in Greenwich, at the Vane residence." There was a pause on the other end. "I am. It's a bit ostentatious for my taste, to be honest." The young man, Caleb, is a bit of a striver. His wife is talented, though. "Why? Don't tell me you're neighbors." "Not quite," I replied, leaning back into the shadows of my office. "I'm the man who just got the door slammed in his face because I didn't fit the aesthetic of the evening. I'm the embarrassing father, Arthur." The silence on the line was absolute. I could almost hear Arthur's brain recalibrating, shifting from polite guest to shark. Arthur knew exactly who I was in the world of finance. He knew that if I pulled my support from Vanguard, the firm would be in a tailspin by Monday morning. "Elias, you're joking," Arthur said, his tone turning dangerously quiet. "I'm not. But I'm coming back, Arthur. I think I've been retired for too long. I'm going to change clothes, and I'm going to drive back to that house. I want you to do me a favor. Don't tell them I called. Just stay at the table. I want to see the look on their faces when they realize that the old man they just insulted is the one who signs their paychecks." "I'll do you one better," Arthur said, and I could hear the grim smile in his voice. "I'll make sure the conversation is centered entirely on the mysterious primary investor we're all hoping to impress this year. We'll be waiting, Elias." I hung up and walked to my closet. I pushed aside the flannels and the denim. In the very back, sealed in a garment bag, was a bespoke midnight blue suit from Savile Row. I hadn't worn it since Martha's funeral. I put it on, the fabric feeling like armor. I checked my reflection. The tired, rejected father was gone. In his place stood a man who had built empires in silence. I didn't take the Chevy this time. I walked to the small detached garage at the back of the property and pulled the silk tarp off the car Martha and I had bought on our 30th anniversary. A pristine, vintage silver Aston Martin DB&M. It started with a roar that shook the rafters. As I pulled out of the driveway, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and adrenaline. I loved my daughter, but she had chosen to live in a world of shadows and mirrors. It was time to turn on the lights. I pushed the car into gear and headed back toward Greenwich. The cold didn't bother me anymore. I had a fire in my gut that was just getting started. What happened next would change the trajectory of our lives forever. As I approached the gates of the estate for the second time that night, the security guard who had ignored me an hour earlier saw the car and the man behind the wheel and scrambled to open the gate. I parked right in the center of the driveway, blocking Caleb's Bentley. I walked up to the door. This time, I didn't ring the bell. I used the spare key I still had in my pocket, the one Madeline had forgotten to ask back. I stepped into the foyer just as Caleb was raising a glass to the table, his voice booming with unearned confidence. "To the future of Vanguard," he toasted, "and to knowing exactly where you belong." I stepped into the light of the dining room, the silk of my suit shimmering. The room went dead silent. Caleb's glass froze halfway to his lips. Madeline's fork clattered against her china plate. But it was Arthur Kensington who moved first. He stood up, a wide, predatory grin on his face, and looked at me. "Partner," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the shock like a knife. "You're late. I was just telling our hosts that the man who owns this company was expected any minute." The color didn't just leave Caleb's face, it seemed to vanish from his very soul. He looked at me, then at Arthur, then back at me. And that was the moment the trap snapped shut. The silence that followed Arthur's words didn't just fill the room. It felt like it had physical weight, pressing the air out of the lungs of everyone present. Caleb's hand, still clutching the expensive crystal glass, was trembling so violently that the wine began to slop over the rim, staining the white linen cuff of his charcoal suit. He looked at Arthur, then at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from a dark pond. Madeline was even worse. She had gone past pale into a sickly, translucent gray. She gripped the back of her chair so hard her knuckles looked like white stones. "Partner?" Caleb finally managed to choke out. The word sounded like it was being dragged over broken glass. "Arthur, there must be some mistake. This is Elias. He's my wife's father. He's a retired carpenter from Bridgeport." Arthur Kensington didn't look away from me as he spoke, but his voice took on that predatory, boardroom edge that had made him a billionaire. "He's also the founder of Sterling Associates, Caleb, the firm that provided 60% of the seed capital for Vanguard Holdings. The man who sits on the board of every major merger we've handled in the last decade. If Elias Sterling decides tomorrow that Vanguard is no longer a sound investment, this house, that suit, and your very career disappear by noon on Monday." I didn't say a word. I just walked toward the table. The guests, the important people Madeline was so desperate to impress, were practically vibrating with the kind of vicarious thrill that only comes from watching a social execution. I saw Marcus Thorne, the head of M.A., leaning back with a look of pure, unadulterated fascination. He knew. They all knew now. The power in the room hadn't just shifted. It had been sucked out of Caleb and Madeline and redirected toward me like a lightning strike. I pulled out the empty chair at the head of the table, the one Caleb had been keeping clear for the guest of honor. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. I sat down slowly, the Savile Row wool of my suit feeling far more natural than the flannel I'd been wearing an hour ago. I looked at the plate in front of me, then up at my daughter. "You said there was no seat for me, Madeline," I said, my voice low and steady. "You said I didn't belong at this table. But the thing about tables is, I've spent my whole life building them. I know exactly how much weight they can hold before they collapse." I looked at the crystal bowl I'd brought back in with me, now sitting on the sideboard. "I just came to bring you your mother's bowl. But since I'm here, and since Arthur has been so kind as to introduce me, perhaps we should talk about the family business." As I sat there, the golden light of the chandelier reflecting in the silverware, my mind drifted back to how we had gotten here. It wasn't just one night of betrayal. It was a slow erosion that had started years ago, though I had been too blinded by a father's love to see the cracks in the foundation. I remembered the day Madeline met Caleb. It was at a high-end alumni mixer at the Waldorf Astoria. I had paid for her ticket, of course, just like I'd paid for the designer dress she'd worn to network. When she introduced him to me a few months later, I saw him for exactly what he was. A shark in a rented tuxedo. He was polished, yes. He had the right handshake, the right vocabulary of disruptive markets and synergistic growth. But his eyes were always moving, always calculating the cost of everything in the room, including me. At the time, Martha was still with us. She was the one who kept me grounded. "Let her have her fun, Elias," she'd say, her hand resting on mine in our small kitchen. "She's young. She wants the bright lights. She'll come back to the soil eventually." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the values we'd raised Madeline with, honesty, hard work, the quiet dignity of a job well done, were still there under the layers of New York City gloss. But then Martha got sick. It happened so fast. One month we were planning a trip to the coast, and the next, I was sitting in a sterilized hospital room, watching the light fade from the eyes of the only woman I'd ever loved. During those 6 months of hell, Caleb and Madeline visited exactly 3 times. Each time, Caleb spent more time in the hallway on his phone than in the room. Madeline would sit by the bed, looking at her watch, her eyes darting toward the door, as if she were afraid the smell of sickness would ruin her Chanel perfume. The day Martha died, I called Madeline. I was sobbing, my heart literally breaking in my chest. "She's gone, Maddie," I'd whispered. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I heard muffled voices, Caleb talking to someone about a closing. Finally, Madeline spoke. "I'm so sorry, Dad. That's awful. Listen, I have a gala tonight for the foundation, but I'll try to come by tomorrow afternoon. Can you handle the funeral arrangements?" Caleb says he knows a place that handles high-end services. She didn't come the next day. She didn't come for a week. When she finally showed up at the funeral, she stayed for 45 minutes and then left because Caleb had a pressing meeting with a client. I stood at the gravesite alone, the freezing rain soaking through my coat, and realized that I was no longer a father to her. I was an obligation, an inconvenient reminder of a life she wanted to leave behind. I should have cut them off then. I should have seen the warning signs when Caleb started asking for short-term bridge loans to cover their investment opportunities. 10,000 here, 50,000 there. It was always a sure thing, always a temporary cash flow issue. I gave it to them, not because I believed in Caleb's business sense. I knew he was a hack, but because I wanted to buy a way back into my daughter's life. I thought if I was the one who funded their dreams, they would eventually have to see me. But the more I gave, the more they loathed me for it. It's a psychological quirk of the weak. They hate the hand that feeds them because it reminds them they can't feed themselves. Caleb began to treat me with a patronizing kind of pity. He started calling me the old man to his friends, mocking my truck, my house, my simple life. He didn't realize that every dollar he was spending to look like a king was coming from the carpenter he looked down on. I had kept my career a secret from Madeline for a reason. When I started Sterling Associates 30 years ago, I promised Martha we would never let the money change us. We lived in the same house, drove the same brand of trucks, and kept our circle small. I wanted Madeline to grow up with a sense of reality. I didn't want her to be a trust fund kid with a hole where her soul should be. By the time she was old enough to understand finance, I had moved entirely into the shadows, operating through shell companies and silent partnerships. To the world, I was a ghost. To my daughter, I was just a man who got lucky with a few stocks and lived on a modest retirement. I didn't know it yet, but Caleb's greed had already dug a grave for their marriage long before this Thanksgiving dinner. Back at the table, the tension was reaching a breaking point. I looked at Caleb, whose face was now a mask of frantic calculation. He was trying to figure out how to spin this. He was a salesman, after all. He thought everything could be fixed with a clever pivot and a firm handshake. "Elias, Dad," Caleb said, his voice wobbling as he tried to force a smile. I think there's been a massive misunderstanding. The stress of the evening, the pressure from the board. I wasn't thinking. You know how it is. We were just so worried about making the right impression." "The right impression?" I asked, picking up a silver spoon and turning it over in the light. "You told me you had nothing to thank me for, Caleb. You told me to get out of your house. But here's the thing. I looked at the mortgage deed for this property last week. It's held by a subsidiary of Sterling Associates. Technically, you're not the host here. You're a tenant, and you're 3 months behind on the private interest payments you owe me." A collective gasp went around the table. Madeline looked like she'd been slapped. She turned to Caleb, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "Behind? Caleb, you told me the bonuses covered the interest. You told me we were clear." Caleb's bravado vanished. He looked like a cornered animal. "It was a bad quarter, Maddie. I had to pivot. I was going to fix it after the Vanguard promotion." I turned my gaze to Arthur Kensington. Arthur was watching the scene with the cold, detached interest of a biologist looking at a specimen. "Arthur, how is Caleb's performance at the firm? He's been telling me he's the top producer in the Northeast Corridor." Arthur took a slow sip of his wine, savoring the moment. "Top producer? Hardly. Caleb has been riding the coattails of the junior analysts for 2 years. In fact, we were actually discussing his restructuring at the board meeting next week. His numbers are inflated, and his expense reports, well, let's just say they're imaginative." Madeline let out a small, choked sound. She looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who used to hide behind my legs when she was scared. But that girl was gone, buried under layers of ego and expensive silk. "Dad, please," she whispered. "Don't do this. Not here. Not in front of them." "You did this in front of them, Madeline," I replied, my voice turning cold. "You rejected your father in front of your important people. You decided that status was more valuable than blood. So now, we're going to play by your rules. We're going to talk status. We're going to talk business." I stood up, leaning my hands on the table. The guests all leaned in, mesmerized. "Caleb, I want a full audit of your personal accounts by Monday morning. Every dollar I've loaned you needs to be accounted for. And Madeline, I think it's time you realize that the life you've been living isn't a legacy. It's a loan, and the bill is coming due." I turned to Arthur. "Arthur, I'd like to invite you and the rest of the board to join me at my club in the city." I think we have some much more interesting things to discuss than Caleb's imaginary commissions." Arthur stood up immediately, followed by Marcus Thorne and the rest of the executives. They didn't even look at Caleb as they moved toward the door. They moved toward the power. They moved toward me. I walked toward the foyer, but before I left, I stopped and looked back at my daughter. She was standing in the middle of her perfect dining room, surrounded by half-eaten gourmet food and shattered dreams. Caleb was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. "I didn't come here to ruin you, Madeline," I said softly. "I came here to see if there was anything left of the daughter I raised. But you showed me exactly who you are." I walked out the door and stepped into the cold night air. The silver Aston Martin was idling, its exhaust a white plume in the moonlight. I felt a strange sense of relief, but also a looming dread. I knew Caleb wouldn't just take this lying down. A man like that, when his back is against the wall, becomes something far more dangerous than a striver. As I pulled away from the curb, I saw a black SUV parked a block down, its lights off. It had been there when I arrived, and it was still there now. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too focused on the adrenaline of the reveal. What I didn't know was that Caleb's bad quarter wasn't just about bad investments. He had gotten himself into something much darker than a debt to his father-in-law. And by walking into that house tonight and exposing him, I hadn't just humiliated him. I had accidentally stepped into the crosshairs of the people Caleb actually worked for. The drive to the city felt shorter than it was, mostly because the silence in the cabin of the Aston Martin was deafening. The adrenaline that had carried me through the dining room reveal was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. I had spent decades protecting my daughter from the harshness of my world, only to have her throw me into the cold to protect her standing in a world of shadows. I checked my rearview mirror. The black SUV was gone, or at least, it was no longer visible. But the feeling of being watched didn't disappear with its headlights. It settled into the marrow of my bones. I met Arthur and the rest of the board at the Sterling Club, a private members-only establishment I'd founded years ago under a shell company. It was tucked away in an old brownstone, unpretentious from the outside, but inside, it was all dark oak, leather-bound books, and the smell of expensive tobacco. It was a place for the men who actually pulled the levers of power to speak without being overheard. Arthur was waiting for me in the library, a glass of neat bourbon already poured. He looked at me with a mixture of respect and something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "You handled that with more restraint than I would have, Elias," Arthur said, sliding the glass toward me. "If my son-in-law had spoken to me like that, I wouldn't have just audited him. I would have buried him." I took a sip of the bourbon, the burn grounding me. He's still her husband, Arthur. At least for now. I wanted to give her a chance to see him for what he is before the hammer falls. "The hammer has already fallen," Marcus Thorne said, stepping into the room. He looked at his tablet, his face grim. "Elias, while you were driving here, I had my team do a deep dive into Caleb Vane's personal portfolios. It's worse than the expense reports. He hasn't just been inflating his numbers. He's been using Vanguard's internal trade signals to front-run his own private accounts. That's not just a policy violation. That's a federal crime." I felt the room tilt. I had known Caleb was a striver, a man who took shortcuts, but I hadn't thought he was stupid enough to gamble with the SEC. "How much? Total gains? Upwards of $4 million over the last 18 months? Marcus replied. "But here's the kicker. The money isn't in his accounts anymore. As soon as it hits his ledger, it gets laundered through a series of offshore sports betting sites and vanishes." "He's a gambler," I whispered, the memory of his bridge lounge suddenly taking on a much darker hue. "Not just a gambler," Arthur added, leaning forward. "You don't lose $4 million on sports betting without someone noticing, unless you're paying back a debt. Elias, I think Caleb got in over his head with some very dangerous people. People who don't care about board meetings or majority shareholders." I sat back, the leather of the chair creaking. I thought about the black SUV. I thought about the way Caleb's eyes had darted toward the window during the dinner, even before I arrived. He wasn't just afraid of me. He was terrified of someone else. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I wasn't a billionaire investor. I was just a father again, remembering a Tuesday afternoon 6 years ago. It was the first time I'd really felt something was wrong. Madeline had brought Caleb to our old house for a Sunday roast. Martha was still alive then, and the house was full of the smell of rosemary and roasting potatoes. Caleb had been on his best behavior, but I caught him in my office while I was in the kitchen helping Martha with the gravy. He was standing by my desk, his fingers tracing the edge of a confidential file regarding a merger I was overseeing. When he saw me, he didn't look embarrassed. He looked curious. "This is a massive deal, Elias," he'd said, his voice smooth as silk. "A lot of people would pay a lot of money to know which way the wind is blowing on this one." "Those people are called criminals, Caleb," I'd replied, taking the file from his hand. "In this house, we value the work, not the shortcut. Don't let me see you in here again." He'd smiled then, that same hollow, practiced smile I saw tonight, and apologized. But the look in his eyes wasn't one of regret. It was one of assessment. He was looking at me not as a father-in-law, but as an obstacle to be bypassed. I should have told Madeline then. I should have warned her that the man she was falling for saw the world as a series of locks to be picked. But she was so happy. She'd spent her life feeling like she lived in my shadow, even when she didn't know how big that shadow was. With Caleb, she felt like she was part of something modern, something elite. I didn't want to be the one to break the spell. The tension in the library was interrupted by the vibration of my phone on the table. It was a text from an unknown number. "The old man has deep pockets. Maybe he can pay the rest of the tab. Tell Caleb the clock is still ticking." Attached was a photo. It was taken through a telephoto lens. It showed me sitting in the library of the club, right now, through the window. Arthur saw my face go white and stood up. "Elias, what is it?" I showed him the phone. Marcus Thorne swore under his breath, and Arthur immediately went to the window, pulling the heavy velvet curtains shut. "They followed you?" Marcus said, his voice tight. "This isn't about business anymore. This is a shakedown." "Who is they?" I asked, though I already had a name in the back of my mind. In the world of high-stakes debt and gritty enforcement in the Northeast, there was one name that kept surfacing in the police reports: Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a legend in the underworld, a man who had started in the unions and moved into high-end extortion. He didn't break legs, he broke lives. He found your weaknesses and squeezed until your entire world collapsed. If Caleb owed him money, it explained the $4 million. It explained the desperation. "I need to talk to Madeline," I said, standing up so quickly my chair nearly toppled. "Elias, wait," Arthur cautioned. "If they're watching you, they're watching her. You can't just go running back there. You'll lead them right to her. They already know where she lives, Arthur. They were parked outside her house tonight." I grabbed my coat, my mind racing. I realized then that my grand reveal at the dinner hadn't just humiliated Caleb. It had signaled to Blackwood's crew that there was a much bigger fish in the pond. By exposing my wealth, I had inadvertently offered myself up as the ultimate collateral for Caleb's debts. I left the club through the service entrance, dodging the main street where I'd parked the Aston Martin. I took a cab to a secure garage across town, where I kept a nondescript Ford SUV for the rare occasions I needed to be invisible. As I drove toward Greenwich, the rain began to fall in earnest, a cold, gray sheet that blurred the world. My phone rang. It was Madeline. I answered on the first ring. "Madeline, are you okay? Where are you?" "Dad?" Her voice was small, choked with tears. "Caleb is gone. He packed a bag and left. He said he had to liquidate some things, and that he'd call me in a few days. But Dad, there are men outside. 2 of them. They're sitting in a black SUV at the end of the driveway. They won't leave. Listen to me very carefully, Maddie," I said, my voice dropping into the tone I used when a deal was falling apart, and every second mattered. "Go to the kitchen. Lock the door to the garage. Get into the pantry, and lock that door too. Don't turn on any lights. I'm 10 minutes away. Dad, I'm scared. What did you do tonight? Why is this happening?" "What I did tonight was show you the truth, Madeline. But what Caleb did, that's what's coming for us now. Just stay quiet. I'm coming." I pushed the Ford to its limit, the tires screaming on the wet pavement. My heart was thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I'd spent my whole life being the smart one, the one who was 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But tonight, I'd been arrogant. I'd let my ego and my hurt feelings dictate my actions, and in doing so, I'd put my daughter in a cage with wolves. As I turned onto her street, I saw the black SUV. It was idling at the curb, its headlights off. It looked like a predator waiting in the tall grass. I didn't slow down. I didn't try to be subtle. I pulled the Ford right up behind the SUV and slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the asphalt. I climbed out, my hand reaching for the heavy tire iron I kept under the driver's seat. The door of the SUV opened, and a man stepped out. He wasn't a thug. He was dressed in a sharp, dark coat, his hair slicked back, his expression one of bored professionalism. This was Silas Blackwood's right hand, a man they called Jax. "Mr. Sterling," Jax said, his voice surprisingly soft. "We were wondering when you'd show up. It's a bit late for a house call, don't you think? Get off this property, I said, my voice shaking with a rage I didn't know I possessed. Now. Or, I swear to God, you won't walk back to your car. Jax laughed, a dry, rattling sound. You've got a lot of fire for an old man, but we're not here for you, Elias. Not yet. We're here for the 6 million your son-in-law still owes us. He seems to have disappeared, which is a real shame. But then we saw you on the news tonight. Or rather, we heard the rumors from the club. The great Elias Sterling, the man with the Midas touch. He stepped closer, the streetlights reflecting in his cold, empty eyes. Caleb said you were just a pathetic old carpenter. He really undersold you. If we'd known you were the one holding the purse strings, we would have come to you months ago. I don't owe you a dime, I spat. Maybe not, Jax replied, glancing toward the darkened mansion. But your daughter is in there, and Caleb left her with a lot of baggage. We can do this the easy way, where you write a check and we disappear. Or we can do it the hard way, where we start taking things back, starting with the house, and everything and everyone inside it. I looked at the house, knowing Madeline was huddled in the dark, terrified. I looked at Jax, realizing that this was only the beginning. The reveal at the dinner wasn't the end of the story. It was the inciting incident of a war. What Jax didn't know was that while I was a father, I was also the man who had built Sterling, associates from the dirt. I knew how to handle threats. And I knew that when someone tries to extort you, you don't give them while I check. You give them a reason to run. 6 million? I asked, my voice suddenly calm. Is that all Caleb owes you? Jack smirked. For tonight, yeah. Fine, I said, reaching into my coat. But I don't carry that kind of cash. I have something better. I pulled out my phone and hit a single button. Suddenly, the street was flooded with light, not from the street lamps, but from 4 other vehicles that had pulled up silently behind us, their high beams blinding. A dozen men in tactical gear stepped out, all of them carrying the unmistakable authority of high-end private security. Arthur Kensington hadn't just let me leave the club. He'd made a few calls of his own. This is my private security detail, Jax, I said, stepping into the light. Every one of them is an ex-Special Forces operator, and they've been authorized to use whatever force is necessary to clear trespassers from my property. Jax's smirk vanished. He looked around, realizing he was suddenly outmanned and outgunned. This isn't over, Sterling, Jax hissed, backing toward his SUV. Blackwood doesn't forget a debt. Good, I replied, because I don't forget a threat. Tell Silas I'm coming for the 4 million Caleb already gave him, and tell him I want it back with interest. The SUV peeled away, the tires screeching. I didn't wait to watch them go. I ran toward the house, my heart in my throat. Madeline, it's me! Open up. The door opened, and Madeline threw herself into my arms, sobbing. I held her tight, the scent of her hair reminding me of when she was a child. But as I looked over her shoulder into the darkened foyer, I saw something on the floor that hadn't been there before. It was a manila envelope. Caleb must have dropped it before he fled. I picked it up, my hands trembling. Inside was a series of photographs. They weren't of business deals or offshore accounts. They were photos of me, not from tonight, from years ago. Photos of me with people I thought were long dead. People from a life I'd spent 30 years trying to bury. I realized then that Caleb hadn't just been gambling with money. He'd been digging into my past, and he'd found the one thing I was more afraid of than Silas Blackwood. I looked at Madeline, the weight of the secret pressing down on me. What happened next would change everything she thought she knew about her father. Because the old man she'd rejected wasn't just a billionaire. He was a man with blood on his hands. The manila envelope felt like it was made of lead. I stood in the middle of Madeline's marble foyer, the house that my money had bought, and felt the floor shifting beneath my feet. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows, a rhythmic drumming that sounded like a countdown. Madeline was still shivering, her breath coming in jagged hitches, as she leaned against the mahogany banister. She looked at the envelope in my hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a dawning, terrible curiosity. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "What's in there? What were those men talking about? Who is Silas Blackwood?" I didn't answer her. I couldn't. I slowly pulled the first photograph from the stack. It was grainier than the others, a black and white shot from a surveillance camera in South Boston, dated October Mutngin Chin Trum Chin Mui born. It showed a younger version of me, leaner, harder, with a coldness in my eyes that I had spent 3 decades trying to erase. I was standing in a rainy alleyway, leaning over the hood of a black Lincoln Continental. Beside me stood a man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. That was Silas Blackwood. In the photo, I was handing him a heavy leather briefcase. I felt a ghost of a chill settle in my spine. I hadn't seen that photo in 30 years. I thought every copy had been burned in the fire that leveled the Harrison warehouse back in Chinwe. I was wrong. Someone had kept a record, and that someone had given it to Caleb. I thought I buried this. I muttered to myself, my thumb brushing over the image of my younger, more dangerous self. Buried what? Madeline stepped forward, her hand reaching out. I instinctively pulled the envelope back, but I was too slow. She caught a glimpse of the second photo, the one of the warehouse fire, and the man lying on the pavement with a Sterling associate seal visible on a crate behind him. Her face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. Dad. Is that a body? I looked at my daughter, the girl I had sheltered in the soft, golden light of Connecticut suburbs and Ivy League dorms. I had spent millions to make sure she never had to see the shadows I walked in, but the shadows had found a way in. They always do. Madeline, go upstairs and pack a bag, I said, my voice dropping into that low, vibratory tone that signaled I wasn't asking. Now, we can't stay here. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me the truth. She suddenly shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. The fear had finally turned into a desperate, frantic anger. You show up here in a car I've never seen, wearing a suit that costs more than my wedding dress, and now there are men with guns outside and photos of you with criminals. Who are you, Elias? Because you aren't the man who taught me how to ride a bike. I took a deep breath, the air in the house feeling thin and cold. I looked at the photograph of me and Silas. I'm exactly who you think I am, Madeline. I'm your father. But before I was your father, I was a fixer for the Sterling Harrison Syndicate. I didn't start Sterling Associates as an investment firm. I started it as a way to clean the money of men who did things you shouldn't even dream about. She backed away from me, her hand over her mouth. A fixer? You mean, a criminal? I was the man who made sure the respectable people of the world stayed respectable, I replied, the truth sounding ugly and jagged in the quiet room. I handled the messes. I settled the debts. And 30 years ago, I made a deal to get out. I walked away with enough capital to build a new life, and I thought I'd paid enough to keep the past quiet. But Caleb didn't just find this. He went looking for it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Caleb hadn't just been a gambler who got in over his head. He was a mole. He had targeted Madeline from the very beginning. He didn't marry into the family for the Sterling name, he married into it because he was working for someone who wanted a hook into me. Silas Blackwood hadn't forgotten. He had been playing the long game, waiting for me to get soft, waiting for me to have something to lose. And I had given him everything. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A private number. I answered it, already knowing who was on the other end. You always did have a flair for the dramatic. Elias, a voice rasped. It was a voice that sounded like stones grinding together. Silas Blackwood. That little stunt with the private security? Very impressive. Arthur Kensington has certainly moved up in the world, but private security doesn't work 24 hours a day, and they don't follow you into your dreams. What do you want, Silas? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone until my knuckles turned white. The money? I'll give you the $6 million Caleb owes you. Double it, if it means you disappear. $6 million is grocery money, Elias. We both know that, Silas chuckled, a dry, wheezing sound. I don't want your money, I want the ledger. The one you took from the Harrison warehouse before you burned it down. The one with the names of every governor, judge, and CEO we serviced for 20 years. I told you 30 years ago, Silas. I burned that ledger. And I didn't believe you then, and I don't believe you now. Caleb spent 3 years looking for it in that mansion of yours, but he couldn't find the safe. He did find those lovely photos, though. A nice little insurance policy. Now, here is the deal. You have 48 hours to bring me the ledger. If you don't, well, I think Madeline would look very different without that pretty face of hers. And Caleb? He's currently sitting in a basement in Queens. He's already told us everything he knows, which wasn't much. But it was enough to confirm you're still the same cold-blooded bastard I knew in Chinwe born. If you touch her, 48 hours, Elias. Tick-tock. The line went dead. I stood there, the silence of the house feeling like a burial vault. Madeline was watching me, her eyes darting between my face and the phone. She had heard enough to know her life was in the balance. He has Caleb, she whispered. Caleb is the reason we're in this mess, Madeline, I said, my voice hardening. He was working for them. He used you. He spent 3 years searching our lives for a way to destroy me. I don't care. He's my husband, Dad. You can't just let them. She stopped, her eyes filling with tears again. God, I don't even know who you are. I don't know who he is. My whole life is a lie. Your life is very real, Madeline, and I'm going to make sure it stays that way, I said, moving toward her. I grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at me. I need you to listen. We are going to a house in the Berkshire Mountains. It's a property even Silas doesn't know about. You will stay there with 4 of Arthur's best men. I am going to finish this. How? You're going to give him the ledger? I looked at the photos in the envelope. The ledger didn't exist. I really had burned it. But Silas would never believe that. In his world, everyone kept a knife behind their back. If I couldn't give him what he wanted, I had to give him something he feared even more. No, I said, my voice sounding like iron. I'm going to do what I should have done 30 years ago. I'm going to settle the debt in blood. I moved through the house with a speed that surprised even me. I went to the library, to the built-in bookshelves that lined the western wall. I pulled a specific copy of The Count of Monte Cristo from the shelf and pressed a hidden latch in the wood behind it. A small compartment popped open. Inside wasn't a ledger. It was a heavy, matte black Sig Sauer and 3 spare magazines, kept in pristine condition. Beside it sat an encrypted satellite phone and a flash drive containing the digital ghosts of Silas Blackwood's own sins. I hadn't touched a weapon in a quarter century. But as I checked the chamber and felt the weight of the steel in my hand, something old and dormant woke up inside me. The carpenter from Bridgeport was gone. The investor from Greenwich was gone. There was only the fixer. Dad? Madeline was standing in the doorway, her bag over her shoulder. She saw the gun, and her breath hitched. Get in the car, Madeline, I said. The drive to the Berkshires was a blur of high-speed turns and constant mirror checks. I didn't talk. I couldn't. I was too busy calculating. I had 48 hours. Silas thought he held all the cards because he had the photos and he had Caleb. But Silas had forgotten one thing. I was the one who taught him how to play the game. I dropped Madeline off at the Montgomery estate, a fortress-like property hidden behind 10 acres of dense woods. I watched her walk inside, flanked by Arthur's men. She didn't look back at me. I couldn't blame her. I had just shattered her world, and I was holding the pieces with bloody hands. Once she was safe, I pulled out the satellite phone and dialed a number I'd memorized decades ago. It belonged to a man named Silas's brother, Vane Blackwood. They hadn't spoken in years, but Vane owed me his life. Elias? Vane's voice was weary. I heard the news. I heard Silas was moving on you. He has my daughter's husband. He's threatening her life. He wants the Harrison ledger. You don't have it, do you? I don't. But I have something he wants more. I have the location of the 6 million Caleb laundered. Caleb didn't lose it gambling. Vane. He was skimming from Silas's own accounts and hiding it in a trust under Madeline's name, a trust he thought I wouldn't notice. 10. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. He was stealing from Silas? That boy is a dead man. He is. But Silas doesn't know where the money is. Only I do. I'm going to set up a meeting. I want you to be there. Not to fight, but to witness. Because when I'm done, there won't be a Blackwood syndicate left to lead. I hung up and looked at the clock on the dashboard. I had 40 hours left. I didn't know it yet, but Caleb had one more betrayal left in him, one that would make the Thanksgiving dinner look like a playground spat. As I drove back toward the city, my phone chimed with a new message. It was a video file. I opened it, and my blood turned to ice. It was Caleb. He wasn't in a basement. He was sitting in a well-lit office, drinking a glass of scotch. He looked directly into the camera and smiled. Hey, Elias, Caleb said, his tone breezy and confident. I figured you'd find the photos. But did you find the GPS tracker I planted in Madeline's jewelry box? The one you just took to your secret safe house? I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding sideways on the mountain road. I realized with a sickening jolt that I hadn't saved Madeline. I had just led the wolves directly to her. And the worst part? Caleb wasn't Silas's prisoner. He was the one pulling Silas's strings. The tires of the Ford screamed against the asphalt, the smell of burnt rubber filling the cabin as I wrestled the steering wheel to keep the vehicle from plummeting over the embankment. My heart wasn't just racing. It was hammering against my ribs with a frantic, sickening rhythm. I stared at the frozen image of Caleb on the screen of my phone, the man I'd walked my daughter down the aisle to meet, the man I'd trusted with her future, and realized I had been played by a master. I didn't know it yet, but the man I thought was a desperate gambler was actually the most dangerous architect I'd ever encountered. He hadn't just stumbled into my past, he had dissected it like a surgeon. I slammed the car into gear, pulling a jagged U-turn that sent gravel flying into the abyss of the mountain pass. I hit the speed dial for the Montgomery estate, my thumb nearly cracking the screen. It rang, and rang, and rang. Each tone was a needle under my fingernails. Finally, the line clicked open, but there was no hello. There was only the sound of heavy breathing and the distant, muffled chime of a grandfather clock. A clock I knew sat in the foyer of the Montgomery safe house. Arthur's men. I hissed into the phone. Put one of them on. Now. They're sleeping, Elias, a voice whispered. It wasn't Jax. It wasn't Silas. It was Caleb. His voice was different now, stripped of the stuttering, frantic edge he'd used at the dinner table. It was calm. It was chillingly resonant. They were good, I'll give you that. But they weren't expecting a family member to walk through the back door with a tray of drugged coffee. You always told Madeline to be hospitable, didn't you? If you touch her, Caleb, I will spend every cent I own to make sure you never see the sun again. You don't own those cents anymore, Elias. Not really, Caleb replied, and I could hear the clink of ice against a glass. He was making himself a drink in my sanctuary. I've been moving the sterling, Associates' liquid assets, for months. Why do you think the interest payments on the mansion were late? It wasn't because I didn't have the money. It was because I was rerouting the flow. You taught me too well, Dad. You told me to always look for the leak in the pipe. I didn't find the leak. I became it. I didn't waste another breath. I stayed on the line, listening to his taunts as I pushed the Ford to 110 miles per hour on roads meant for 40. The mountains were a blur of dark pines and gray stone, a landscape that mirrored the desolation in my chest. When I reached the gates of the Montgomery estate, they were wide open. The iron wings hung uselessly in the rain. I didn't slow down. I roared up the winding driveway, the headlights catching the bodies of 2 security guards sprawled on the lawn. They weren't dead. I could see the rise and fall of their chests, but they were out cold. Caleb hadn't wanted a bloodbath yet. He wanted an audience. I skidded to a halt in front of the stone portico, the Sig Sauer already in my hand. I didn't feel 64 years old. I felt like a machine made of cold steel and old regrets. I kicked the front door open, the heavy oak thudding against the interior wall. The foyer was lit by a dozen flickering candles. It looked like a shrine, or a funeral. In the center of the room, sitting in a high-backed velvet chair, was Caleb Vane. He looked immaculate. He'd changed into a fresh shirt, one of mine, I realized with a surge of bile, and he was holding a glass of 20-year-old scotch. Silas Blackwood was there, too, standing in the shadows by the fireplace, his scarred face twisted into a smirk. But Silas wasn't the one in charge. He was standing 3 paces behind Caleb. And then I saw Madeline. She was tied to a chair in the corner, a piece of silver duct tape across her mouth. Her eyes were red-rimmed and blown wide, with a terror that broke what was left of my heart. She looked at me, and I saw the moment she realized her father was a man who held a gun like he'd been born with it. Put the gun down, Elias, Caleb said, not even looking up from his drink. Silas is a bit jumpy, and his men have a laser dot currently resting on the back of Madeline's head. Let's not be messy. I lowered the cig, but I didn't holster it. You've gone to a lot of trouble for a man you called pathetic 3 hours ago, Caleb. The pathetic act was for the board, Caleb said, finally looking at me. His eyes were flat, devoid of the humanity I'd spent years trying to foster in him. And for Madeline, she needed to believe I was the victim of your cold corporate heart. It made her more likely to give me the codes to your personal server when I asked her for help with our finances. He stood up, walking toward Madeline. He ran a hand over her hair, a gesture that made her flinch so hard she nearly tipped the chair. She's a beautiful girl, Elias. A bit naive, but beautiful. She really thought we were a team. She thought we were building a legacy. But you and I know the truth. Legacies aren't built, they're stolen. Why? I asked, my voice a low growl. I gave you everything. I funded your life. I gave you my daughter. You gave me scraps, Caleb suddenly roared, his calm mask slipping for a fraction of a second. You sat in that little house in Bridgeport, pretending to be a common man, while you sat on a mountain of gold that belonged to the syndicate. You think I didn't know? My father was Harrison's driver. The one you cleared from the warehouse fire? He didn't die in the fire, Elias. He died in a prison cell 3 years later because you made him the fall guy. The air left my lungs. The Harrison warehouse. The driver. I remembered him, a man named Thomas Vane. I hadn't made him the fall guy. He had been the one who set the fire. But I realized then that the story Caleb had been told was very different from the one I had lived. "Your father was a traitor, Caleb," I said. "He was selling syndicate secrets to the feds. I saved his life by putting him in that cell. If Silas had caught him, he would have been buried in the foundations of the Holland Tunnel. Liars always have a good story." Silas rasped from the shadows, stepping forward. "But stories don't pay the bills, Elias." Caleb came to me with a plan. He said he could get me the sterling fortune and the location of the assets you've been hiding for 30 years. All I had to do was provide the muscle. Caleb smiled, the warmth returning to his face in a way that was more terrifying than his anger. "And here we are. The family gathered for the holidays. It's poetic, really." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a legal document. He tossed it onto the coffee table between us. "Transfer of power," Caleb said. "It signs over the majority share of Sterling, associates to a holding company controlled by me and Silas. It also authorizes the release of the contingency funds you have stashed in the Cayman accounts. Sign it, and you and Madeline walk out of here. You go back to your little house, you keep your old truck, and you live out the rest of your days as the simple man you love to pretend to be." "And if I don't?" Caleb walked back to Madeline. He reached out and slowly peeled the tape from her mouth. She let out a sob, her voice raw. "Dad, don't do it," she screamed. "He's been talking to them. He told Silas he was going to kill you anyway. He's lying." Caleb backhanded her. It wasn't a hard blow, but the sound of it, the sharp crack of his hand against her cheek, sent a shockwave through me that turned my vision red. "Quiet, Maddie," Caleb whispered, leaning down to her ear. "The adults are talking." He looked back at me. 48 hours was the original timeline. But I'm an impatient man. You have 60 seconds to sign that paper, or Silas starts with her fingers. He's very good at his job, Elias. He's had 30 years of practice while you were out buying flannel shirts. I looked at the document. I looked at the gun in my hand. I looked at my daughter, whose face was already beginning to bruise. I realized that the fixer hadn't been woken up tonight. He had been waiting for this moment his entire life. "I can't sign that, Caleb," I said, my voice eerily calm. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "You're choosing the money over her? I knew you were cold. But this? I'm not choosing the money," I said. I reached into my coat and pulled out a small, black remote. "I'm choosing the truth. You said you've been rerouting my assets for months. You said you found the leaks, but you forgot who built the pipes." I pressed the button. Suddenly, every light in the house went out. Not just the lights, the power died. The electronic locks on the doors clicked shut. The security system, which I had secretly upgraded years ago with a blackout protocol, went into total lockdown. In the pitch black, I heard Silas shout and the sound of a chair being overturned. "What did you do?" Caleb screamed, his voice pitching high with panic. "I took away your advantage," I whispered in the dark. I didn't need light. I knew this house. I had designed the layout myself. I moved to the left, silent as a ghost, as the sound of Silas's men fumbling for flashlights echoed through the foyer. What happened next changed everything. I didn't go for Caleb. I went for the one thing I knew he couldn't control. I fired a single shot. Not at a person, but at the massive crystal chandelier above the table. It shattered, a rain of glass and heavy brass falling into the center of the room. In the chaos, I heard a man scream one of Silas's thugs. "Find him," Silas bellowed. "Kill him. Kill the old man." But I wasn't an old man anymore. I was a shadow in the house of Sterling. I reached Madeline in the darkness, my fingers finding the ropes at her wrists. I sliced through them with a pocket knife I'd kept hidden in my sleeve. "Run to the basement, Madeline," I hissed. "The panic room is behind the wine cellar. Go, now." "What about you?" she sobbed. "I'm finishing the job." I pushed her toward the hallway just as a flashlight beam cut through the room. It caught me for a split second, and I saw Caleb standing by the fireplace, a small, silver pistol in his hand. He looked terrified. He wasn't a shark anymore. He was a boy who had poked a sleeping lion. "Elias!" Caleb screamed, firing blindly into the dark. The bullet hissed past my ear, thudding into the wood of the velvet chair. I didn't fire back. Not yet. I wanted him to feel the weight of what was coming. I wanted him to understand that you can steal a man's money, and you can steal his reputation, but you can never steal his nature. I slipped into the kitchen, the swinging door clicking shut behind me. I could hear Silas and his men moving through the foyer, their boots heavy on the marble. They were disorganized. They were fighting in a house that was now a weapon. But then, a new voice came over the house's intercom system, a system that should have been dead. "Change of plans, Elias," the voice said. It wasn't Caleb. It wasn't Silas. It was Arthur Kensington. "I'm sorry, my old friend," Arthur said, his voice echoing through the dark halls with a chilling clarity. "But Caleb made me a better offer. You see, Vanguard Holdings was never about the investments. It was about the debt, and your debt to the syndicate is finally being called in, by me." I froze in the darkness of the kitchen. The betrayal didn't just go deep, it went all the way to the top. Arthur, my oldest friend, the man I had trusted to protect my daughter, was the silent partner Caleb had been working for all along. The kitchen door swung open, and the light of a dozen tactical flashlights flooded the room. I was surrounded. "Drop the gun, Elias." Arthur's voice came over the speaker. "Before we find where Madeline is hiding." I looked at the black muzzles of the rifles pointed at my chest. I looked at the dark windows, the rain still pouring down. I had reached rock bottom. My daughter was in a hole, my friend was my executioner, and my legacy was a lie. What happened next changed everything. I whispered to myself, the words of bitter promise. I dropped the Sig Sauer onto the tile floor. "Good choice," Jack said, stepping out from behind the men, a smirk on his face. He stepped forward and drove the butt of his rifle into my stomach. As I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, I saw Caleb walk into the room. He looked down at me, his face twisted in a sneer of triumph. He reached down and snatched the remote from my hand. "You really thought you were the smartest person in the room, didn't you, Dad?" Caleb laughed. He didn't know that the remote wasn't for the power. He didn't know that by taking it, he had just activated the one thing I had kept as a last resort for 30 years. The house didn't just go dark, it began to hum, a low, vibrating frequency that made the teeth ache. "What is that?" Silas asked, his voice shaking. "That," I wheezed from the floor, a bloody smile spreading across my face, "is the sound of the Sterling Harrison ledger being uploaded to every federal server in the country. If I die, or if this house isn't reset in 10 minutes, everyone in this room and everyone in that ledger is finished." The room went dead silent. The hum grew louder. And then, the front door of the estate didn't just open. It was blown off its hinges. The explosion was a physical wall of heat and sound that tore through the kitchen, throwing me flat against the cold tile. Dust and pulverized drywall filled the air, tasting like chalk and cordite. My ears were ringing a high-pitched, screaming whine that drowned out the shouts of the men around me. Through the haze, I saw the silhouette of Silas's thugs staggering, their tactical flashlights cutting frantic, erratic arcs through the smoke. I didn't know it then, but the man who had just blown my door off wasn't the FBI. He wasn't the cavalry. He was a ghost I had spent 30 years trying to forget, and his arrival was the final piece of a trap I had started setting the moment Caleb first stepped into my woodshop years ago. I rolled onto my stomach, my ribs screaming in protest. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. I looked up and saw Arthur Kensington standing by the island, his face illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. He wasn't panicking. He looked disappointed, like a master chess player whose opponent had just knocked over the board. "You always were messy, Elias." Arthur's voice boomed through the intercom, though he was standing right there. He adjusted his cufflinks, stepping over a pile of debris. "The upload is a bluff. I know you. You'd never give the feds that kind of power. You're a gatekeeper. You die before you hand over the keys to the kingdom." He was right, but the bluff wasn't for him. It was for the men with the guns. The smoke cleared just enough to reveal the intruders. It wasn't a tactical team. It was 5 men dressed in long, heavy coats, led by a man whose face was a map of old scars and bitter winters. Vane Blackwood, Silas's older brother, stepped into the kitchen, a short-barreled shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. "Hello, Silas," Vane said, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "I hear you've been making deals with the help." Silas backed away, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "Vane, what are you doing here? This is business." "This is for the Syndicate. The Syndicate is a memory, little brother." Vane spat, his eyes moving to Caleb, who was currently trying to crawl toward the back exit. "And this boy? He's the son of a rat. You're standing in a house built on blood, taking orders from a man in a 3-piece suit who wouldn't know a rainy alleyway from a hole in the ground." The tension in the room snapped. One of Silas's men, twitchy and blinded by the smoke, raised his rifle. Vane didn't even flinch. He fired. The roar of the shotgun was deafening in the confined space, the force of the blast throwing the gunman back into the breakfast nook. In the chaos, I moved. I didn't go for my gun, I went for Caleb. I lunged across the floor, my fingers locking around his ankle. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched yelp, kicking at my face with his polished Italian loafers. I dragged him down, the rage that had been simmering since Tuesday finally boiling over. I pinned him against the base of the cabinets, my forearm pressing into his throat. "Where is she, Caleb?" I hissed, my face inches from his. "The panic room code." "Now." "Go to hell," he gasped, his eyes bulging. "Arthur has the override. You're finished, Elias. Even if Vane kills us, Arthur's already moved the money. You're a billionaire on paper and a pauper in reality." I felt a cold, sharp realization hit me. I looked up at Arthur, who was watching our struggle with a look of bored amusement. Arthur hadn't just betrayed our friendship. He had spent years, decades, perhaps infiltrating my life. He didn't just want the syndicate's secrets. He wanted the Sterling name. He wanted to replace me. "The money doesn't matter, Caleb," I whispered. I reached into his pocket and pulled out the remote he'd snatched from me earlier. I didn't take it back. I jammed my thumb down on a secondary hidden button on the side. A heavy, metallic clunk echoed from the floor beneath us. The kitchen island, the massive, 3-ton block of marble and steel, began to slide back on hidden rails. Beneath it sat a vault door, the kind used by banks in the Motngin Chintram Haimuis. "That's not the panic room, is it?" Caleb stammered, his bravado finally crumbling into raw, naked fear. "No," I said, pulling him toward the opening. "This is where I keep the things I don't want the world to see. And tonight, you're going to be one of them." I threw him into the dark maw of the vault, just as Silas fired at Vane. The kitchen erupted into a full-scale firefight. I dove for cover behind the marble island as bullets shredded the custom cabinetry and shattered the vintage wine bottles. The air was filled with the smell of expensive Cabernet and gunpowder. I saw Vane's men systematically dismantling Silas's crew. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Silas was cornered by the refrigerator, his gun jammed, his eyes darting frantically for an exit that didn't exist. Vane walked up to him, the shotgun leveled at his brother's chest. "You should have stayed in Southie, Silas," Vane said softly. He didn't hesitate. The blast was final. I turned my attention to Arthur. He was gone. He'd slipped out during the first volley of shots, likely heading for the basement to find Madeline. He knew she was my only weakness. He knew that as long as he had her, he had me. I scrambled out of the kitchen, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't follow the main stairs. I went to the servants' lift, a manual hand-cranked pulley system I'd restored years ago. I rode it down to the cellar level, the darkness swallowing me. The basement was a labyrinth of stone and shadow. I could hear the distant, muffled sound of Arthur's voice. He was calling for Madeline, his tones sweet and paternal, the same voice he'd used to toast my health at a dozen charity galas. "Come out, Maddie," Arthur called. "Your father is gone. Caleb is gone. I'm the only one left who can protect you. Don't you want to keep the house? Don't you want the life you deserve?" I moved through the wine cellar, my boots silent on the packed dirt floor. I reached the heavy iron door of the panic room. It was scratched. Arthur had been trying to force the keypad. He was standing there, a small, elegant Beretta in his hand, looking more like a disgruntled professor than a mass murderer. "It's over, Arthur," I said, stepping into the dim light of a single emergency bulb. Arthur turned, his expression shifting into a weary smile. "Elias, you're like a cockroach. I've tried to drown you in debt, bury you in scandal, and now shoot you in your own home. And yet here you are, still wearing that ridiculous flannel under your suit. Why, Arthur? We were brothers in everything but blood." "That's exactly why," Arthur spat, his composure finally breaking. "I was the brains, Elias. I was the one who turned your dirty syndicate cash into a legitimate empire. But it was always Sterling, associates. It was always your face on the cover of the journals. I spent 30 years as your shadow. I watched you play the simple man while I did the hard work of maintaining the lie. I didn't just want your money. I wanted your life. I wanted Madeline to look at me with the pride she used to have for you. You killed Martha, didn't you?" The question came out of me before I could even process it. It was a hunch, a dark seed that had been germinating in my mind since the night she died. Arthur's silence was my answer. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look guilty. "She was going to convince you to retire early," Arthur said softly. "She wanted you to sell the firm to a public conglomerate. If you had done that, my creative accounting would have been discovered by the auditors within a week. I couldn't let her take my life away. So, I took hers. A little adjustment to her medication. It was painless, Elias. Truly. The world went white. The grief I had been carrying for years suddenly transformed into a white-hot nova of pure, unadulterated fury. I didn't care about the gun in his hand. I didn't care about the feds, Or the ledger. Or the money. I lunged. Arthur fired, the bullet grazing my shoulder, but the adrenaline was a thick, numbing armor. I slammed into him, the force carrying us both into a rack of vintage Bordeaux. The wood splintered, hundreds of bottles crashing down around us. We rolled through the glass and the wine, two old men fighting like animals in the red-stained dark. I got my hands around his throat, my thumbs pressing into his windpipe. Arthur clawed at my face, his nails tearing into my skin, but I didn't let go. I wanted to see the light fade from his eyes the way it had faded from Martha's. Dad. Stop. The scream came from behind the panic room door. The override had finally timed out. The door slid open, and Madeline stood there, her face tear-streaked and terrified. She saw me bloody, wild-eyed, a murderer in the making. Don't do it, she sobbed. If you kill him like this, you're exactly what they said you were. You're the ghost. Please, Dad, don't leave me alone with this. My grip slackened. I looked at Arthur, who was gasping for air, his face purple, his eyes filled with a pathetic, whimpering fear. He wasn't a titan. He was a small, jealous man who had spent his life living a lie. I pulled back, standing up shakily. I reached down and picked up the Beretta Arthur had dropped. I checked the magazine, my movements mechanical. You're right, Maddie, I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Death is too easy for him. I looked at Arthur. The upload I mentioned earlier? I lied about that too. I didn't send it to the feds. I sent it to the one group of people who hate traitors more than the law does. I sent the records of your creative accounting and your side deals with Silas to the remaining syndicate families in Chicago and Jersey. Arthur's eyes went wide. No, Elias, you can't. They're already on their way, Arthur, I said, checking my watch. Vane Blackwood was just the vanguard. The rest of them will be here by dawn, and they don't believe in painless medication. I turned to Madeline and held out my hand. We're leaving. Now. We walked out of the basement, leaving Arthur screaming in the red-stained dark. We passed through the kitchen, where Vane was calmly lighting a cigarette amidst the carnage. He nodded to me a silent acknowledgement between two men who had survived the fire. The boy in the vault? Vane asked. He's all yours, I replied. Madeline and I stepped out onto the porch. The rain had stopped, and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed over the horizon. The Montgomery estate was a ruin, but as I looked at my daughter, I realized that for the first time in 30 years, the air was clear. What happens now? Madeline asked, her voice small. Now, I said, looking at the long road ahead, we find out if there's anything left of the Sterlings that isn't built on a lie. But the truth was deeper than I imagined. As we reached the bottom of the driveway, a single black sedan was waiting. The window rolled down, revealing a woman I hadn't seen in 20 years. A woman who looked exactly like a middle-aged version of Madeline. Hello, Elias, the woman said, her voice a haunting echo of my past. I think it's time we talked about what really happened in what Ngin Chin Trum Chin Mui born. My heart stopped. The reversal wasn't over. It was just beginning. I felt the air turn to ice in my lungs. The woman sitting in the back of that black sedan didn't just look like Martha. She was the living, breathing ghost of the woman I had buried 3 years ago. Her hair was shorter now, a sophisticated silver bob that caught the weak morning light, and she wore a camel hair coat that screamed old money elegance. But the eyes, those sharp, hazel eyes that had once looked at me with what I thought was unconditional love, were as cold as the Atlantic in January. Madeline let out a sound that wasn't a scream or a sob, but a raw, animalistic whimper. She collapsed against the side of the Ford, her legs giving way as she stared at the face of the mother she had mourned. Mom? Madeline's voice was a ragged whisper. Is that... Are you... How? The woman didn't move to get out of the car. She didn't reach out for her daughter. She simply sat there, a queen on a dark throne, watching us with a terrifyingly detached curiosity. You look like you've seen a ghost, Elias, she said, her voice smooth and devoid of the warmth I had lived for during our 30-year marriage. I suppose, in a way, you have. Arthur told me he killed you, I managed to say, my hand gripping the door of the Ford so hard the metal groaned. He told me he adjusted your medication. I felt your pulse stop, Helena. I watched them lower you into the ground. The woman, whose real name was Helena Montgomery Sterling, finally stepped out of the car. She didn't look like a woman who had fought cancer. She looked like a woman who had never spent a day in her life feeling anything as pedestrian as pain. Arthur did exactly what I told him to do, Helena said, walking toward us with a graceful, predatory stride. He gave me the opportunity to disappear. I needed a way out of the domestic cage you'd built for me, Elias. And more importantly, I needed to manage the Montgomery interests from the shadows. The Sterling Harrison Syndicate was always just a branch of my family's tree. You were a very capable gardener, but you were never the owner. I looked at her, and in that moment, the last 30 years of my life didn't just feel like a lie. They felt like a choreographed play. The simple man from Bridgeport, the fixer with the golden touch, I had been the lead actor in a script I hadn't even written. The cancer? I asked. A cocktail of beta blockers and a very expensive private medical team, she replied, as if she were discussing a corporate merger. The funeral was a bit much, I'll admit, but you always did love a grand tragedy. It kept you focused. It kept you building the empire while I moved the pieces where they actually belonged. Madeleine surged forward, her rage finally overcoming her shock. You let me cry for years. I stood by your bed while you pretended to die. I went to therapy for 18 months because I couldn't handle the hole you left in my life. And you did it for interest rates and syndicate power? Helena looked at her daughter, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of something regret. No, it was more like pity. I did it to ensure you'd have the life you have now, Madeline. I knew Caleb was a worm, but he was a necessary worm. He was the catalyst I needed to bring Elias back into the fold. Arthur got greedy, and Caleb got ambitious, but the end result is the same. The Sterling name is clean, the Harrison ledger is gone, and the Montgomery assets are tripled. I'm not a piece of your portfolio, Madeline spat, her voice shaking with a fury that made me proud. Everyone is a piece of a portfolio, darling, Helena said softly. You just have to decide if you're the asset or the liability. She turned back to me. Elias, Vane Blackwood is currently cleaning up the mess in your kitchen. By noon, Arthur Kensington will be a footnote in the history of Vanguard Holdings. I'm offering you a seat at the real table now. No more flannel, keyed and safes in the wall. You join me, and we run the East Coast as it was meant to be run, as a family. I looked at the house on the hill, still smoking from the breach. I thought about Arthur, who was likely being torn apart by the syndicate I had inadvertently summoned. I thought about Caleb, the boy who thought he was a king, now locked in a vault. And then I looked at my daughter, whose face was a mask of betrayal and heartbreak. I realized then that I had hit rock bottom, not because I had lost my money, and not because my life was in danger. I had hit rock bottom because I realized that the only person I had ever truly trusted, the woman who had been my anchor, was the one who had been holding the knife all along. I didn't know it yet, I thought to myself, the words echoing in the hollow chambers of my mind. But this wasn't the end of my revenge. It was just the target changing. No, I said, my voice sounding like gravel. Helena's eyes narrowed. No, I'm not joining you, Helena. And you're not taking Madeline. You're in no position to bargain, Elias, she said. And suddenly, 4 men stepped out of the woods surrounding the driveway. They were dressed in the same charcoal suits Caleb had favored. But these men didn't look like strivers. They looked like professionals. The Montgomery estate is my territory. Arthur was just a placeholder. These men aren't syndicate. They're private contractors. They don't have codes or loyalties. They have bank accounts. Dad, let's just go, Madeline whispered, pulling on my arm. We can't go, Maddie, I said, looking her in the eyes. Because your mother won't let us. She's already decided we're liabilities. Helena sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. I really hoped you'd be smarter than this, Elias. You were always the best at seeing the long game. Can't you see that this is the only way out? You surrender the Cayman codes to me, you sign the final release for Sterling, Associates, and I'll give you a quiet life in Europe. You can have your woodshop, you can have your peace. And Madeline? Madeline stays with me. She needs to learn how to lead. She has the Montgomery blood. She just needs the right environment. That was the moment the last of the Elias Sterling who played by the rules died. I reached into my pocket. I didn't pull out a gun. I pulled out a small, battered silver lighter. It was the one Martha, the real Martha, the one I remembered, had given me on our 10th anniversary. You told me once that the most important thing a builder can know is when a structure is too far gone to save, I said, my thumb flicking the wheel. The flame danced in the morning wind. You think you own the pipes, Helena. You think you own the flow, but you forgot one thing about the Sterling Harrison Syndicate. And what's that? She asked, her voice tight. We didn't just clean money. We built the infrastructure of this entire county. The gas lines, the electrical grids, the underground tunnels. I didn't just build the panic room in that house. I built the foundation of the entire Montgomery subdivision. I looked up at the estate. And I never build anything without a kill switch. I dropped the lighter into the drainage grate at my feet. For a second, Nothing happened. Helena laughed. A sharp, mocking sound. A lighter, Elias. Really? You finally lost your mind. And then, the ground began to vibrate. A low, deep rumbling started in the earth, coming from the direction of the house. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of a structural failure. I had known for years that the Montgomery estate sat on a dormant limestone vein. When I built the house, I had installed a series of high-pressure hydraulic pumps in the sub-basement, ostensibly for foundation stabilization. In reality, they were designed to flood the limestone with caustic chemicals that would dissolve the rock in minutes, creating a localized sinkhole. It was my insurance policy. If the syndicate ever tried to take the house, I would give them the house straight into the earth. A massive crack appeared in the driveway, snaking up toward the portico. The trees began to lean, their roots screaming as the ground gave way. "What are you doing?" Helena screamed, her composure finally shattering as the black sedan began to tilt into the widening fissure. "I'm clearing the portfolio, Helena," I said. The house didn't just collapse. It was swallowed. In a terrifying display of engineering turned to destruction, the Montgomery estate, the symbol of their power, the vault where Caleb was trapped, the place where Arthur was waiting for death slid into the earth. A cloud of dust and debris billowed out, white and choking. The four contractors scrambled back, their professional masks replaced by primal fear as the driveway beneath them began to crumble. In the chaos, I grabbed Madeline and shoved her into the Ford. I didn't wait to see if Helena survived the collapse. I didn't wait to see the syndicate's reaction. I slammed the car into gear and roared down the mountain road, leaving the ghost of my wife standing on the edge of a grave she had dug for herself. We drove for 3 hours in total silence. Madeline was curled in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing blur of the Connecticut countryside. I didn't know where we were going, only that we had to get to the one place Helena would never think to look. We finally stopped at a small, dilapidated marina on the Jersey shore. I pulled the Ford behind a row of rusted shipping containers and killed the lights. "Dad?" Madeline asked, her voice hollow. "Who are we now?" I looked at my hands. They were covered in dust and dried blood. I looked in the rearview mirror at the man I had become. I wasn't a billionaire. I wasn't a fixer. I was a man who had lost everything except the girl sitting next to me. "We're the people who are going to finish this, Maddie," I said. "Your mother thinks she won because she has the money, but she forgot the most important rule of the game." "What rule?" "The person who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room." I reached under the dashboard and pulled out a hidden GPS tracker. It wasn't one that Caleb had planted. It was one I had placed on Helena's camel hair coat when she'd brushed Pang on the driveway. I looked at the glowing red dot on the screen. She was moving. She was heading toward a private airfield in Teterboro. She was planning to flee. I didn't know it yet. I whispered to the dark cabin of the truck. But the real reversal was just beginning, and this time, there wouldn't be any survivors. I turned to Madeline. "I need you to stay here. There's a boat in slip 42. The keys are under the seat. If I'm not back by dawn, you take that boat and you go to the coordinates in the glove box. Do you understand?" "No," she said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce strength. "I'm coming with you. You said I have the Montgomery blood, right? Well, let's see what happens when that blood gets spilled." I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't see the daughter I needed to protect. I saw the partner I needed to win. "All right," I said, handing her a spare magazine for the SIG. "Let's go hunting." The drive to Teterboro was the longest hour of my life. The rain had returned, a cold, indifferent drizzle that streaked across the windshield, like tears on a window pane. Beside me, Madeline sat with the Sig Sauer resting on her lap, her fingers tracing the serrated edge of the grip. She didn't look like a girl who had been crying for her mother anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally realized that the world wasn't made of golden light, but of shadows and stone. The red dot on the tracker was stationary now, hangar-borne, the Montgomery private wing. Helena was getting ready to fly to a non-extradition territory, likely the islands or a private compound in the Mediterranean. She thought she was leaving the wreckage of her old life behind. She thought she had won. What she didn't know was that I hadn't just been building a legacy for 30 years. I had been building a cage. "Dad," Madeline said, her voice steady as we pulled into the shadow of the perimeter fence. "When we get in there, if she tries to talk her way out of this, don't listen. She's had 30 years to tell the truth. She chose the lie." "I know, Maddie," I said, cutting the engine and the lights. "But there's one thing you need to understand. Your mother didn't just stay alive to run the Montgomery empire. She stayed alive because she's addicted to the game. And in the game, the only way to truly beat someone like her isn't to kill her. It's to make her irrelevant. We slipped through a gap in the fence I'd cut years ago during a security audit for the airport. The tarmac was a vast, slick expanse of gray, punctuated by the blue and yellow taxiway lights. Hangar Bourne loomed ahead, a massive steel cavern. Through the small side windows, I could see the sleek, white tail of the Montgomery Gulf Stream. We entered through the service door, the smell of jet fuel and ozone thick in the air. Helena was standing at the base of the plane's stairs, talking to a man in a pilot's uniform. She was holding a briefcase, the one that contained the hard drives, the offshore keys, and the last of the Sterling liquid assets. She looked beautiful, untouchable, and utterly alone. "The flight plan is filed, Mrs. Sterling," the pilot said. "We're cleared for departure in 10 minutes. "Good," Helena replied, her voice echoing in the hollow hangar. "The sooner we're over international waters, the better. I want the Sterling accounts fully integrated by the time we land." "I'm afraid there's a problem with the integration, Helena." I stepped out from behind a stack of shipping crates, Madeline right beside me. The pilot reached for a sidearm, but Madeline didn't hesitate. She leveled the SIG at his chest. "Don't," she said, and the coldness in her voice made the pilot freeze. Helena turned slowly. She didn't look surprised. She looked annoyed, like a teacher interrupted by a troublesome student. "Elias, you really are persistent. I suppose the sinkhole wasn't deep enough to hold you." "The sinkhole was just for the house, Helena," I said, walking toward her. "The real collapse is happening right now, in your accounts." Helena smirked, clutching the briefcase tighter. "I have the codes, Elias. I have the Montgomery keys. You can't stop the transfer from a hangar floor." "I didn't stop the transfer," I said, stopping 10 feet away. "I redirected it. You see, you think you were managing the Montgomery interests for 30 years. You thought Arthur was your loyal placeholder, but Arthur wasn't working for you. He wasn't even working for me." Helena's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" "Arthur was a gambler, Helena. He owed money to people far more dangerous than Silas Blackwood. To pay them off, he created a shadow Montgomery ledger. He's been skimming from your family's estate for 2 decades. When I found out 5 years ago, I didn't expose him. I helped him." I stepped closer, the light of the hangar reflecting in my eyes. "I helped him build a digital mirror. Every time you moved money into a secure Montgomery account, it was actually being funneled into a trust labeled the Sterling Education Fund, a fund that only has one authorized signatory." I looked at Madeline. Helena's face finally cracked. The mask of the Queen fell away, revealing the terrified girl underneath. She frantically opened the briefcase, pulling out a ruggedized tablet. Her fingers flew across the screen, her breath hitching as she logged into her master terminal. "No," she whispered. It's zero. Everything. The Caymans, the Swiss holdings, they're all empty." "It's not empty, Mom," Madeline said, her voice echoing with a haunting finality. "It's just not yours. I just authorized the transfer of the entire Montgomery Sterling estate to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. By the time the sun is up, the Montgomery Empire will be the largest charitable donation in America. Helena collapsed against the stairs of the jet, the tablet sliding from her hand and cracking on the concrete. She looked at us, and for the first time, she looked her age. The silver hair, the expensive coat, it all looked like a costume on a ghost. "You ruined us," Helena hissed, her voice a jagged shard of glass. "Everything we built, everything the Montgomerys stood for 100 years, you threw it away for a charity?" "I didn't throw it away, Helena," I said. "I used it to buy our freedom. The feds are on their way. Vane Blackwood is already talking to the district attorney. He's giving them Silas. He's giving them Arthur's records. And most importantly, he's giving them the location of the woman who faked her own death to run a criminal syndicate." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Blue and red lights began to dance against the hangar's frosted glass windows. What happened next changed everything, I thought. Looking at the broken woman on the floor, I walked up to Helena and reached out my hand. For a split second, she looked like she might take it, but I didn't reach for her. I reached for the silver lighter I'd picked up from the driveway of the estate. I set it on the step beside her. "Keep it," I said. "It's the only thing left from the life we actually had." I turned to Madeline. "Let's go." We walked out of the hangar just as the first wave of black SUVs swarmed the tarmac. We didn't run. We didn't hide. We walked right past the agents, our heads held high. I had already made the calls. My lawyers were waiting. The fixer had one last job to do, turning state's evidence to ensure that the Sterling name was buried forever, and the names of the victims were finally heard. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled. I stood on the porch of a small, quiet cottage on the coast of Maine. It wasn't a mansion. It didn't have a wine cellar or a panic room. It had a woodshop in the back and a view of the Atlantic that didn't cost a dime. Madeline was sitting on the porch swing, a law school textbook in her lap. She had decided to use the Sterling name for one last thing, getting a degree to help people who had been crushed by men like Caleb and Arthur. The news had been full of the Sterling Montgomery fall. Arthur Kensington had been found dead in his cell, a casualty of the syndicate's reach. Caleb Vane had vanished. Some said he was in a witness protection program. Others said Vane Blackwood had taken him to a place where he'd never be found. Helena was awaiting trial in a federal facility, stripped of her titles, her wealth, and her family. I sat down next to my daughter, the smell of cedar on my hands. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't calculating the weight of a table or the cost of a lie. "Dad?" Madeline asked, looking at the horizon. "Do you think we really won?" I looked at her, the girl I had almost lost to the shadows, now standing in the light. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinner, the slamming door, and the long, bloody road we'd traveled to get here. "We're here, Maddie," I said, taking her hand. "And the table is exactly the right size." I didn't know it then, but the greatest revenge wasn't the sinkhole or the empty bank accounts. It was the fact that we were finally, truly, just ourselves. The old man in the flannel shirt was finally home.